How do you begin a show about a topic or an interest you hold so dear? How do you find the perfect tone, cadence, and diction to truly capture and pay reverence to the thing you love so much? What is the inception point? Where is the balance between critical analysis and pure fandom? Those are the questions I have to ask myself, especially before starting this. I'm certainly prepared to record. I've been doing podcasts on and off for years. However, never, ever done a solo show. Sure, in the future, I would like there to be guests, interviews, people to come on to talk about this stuff with, this thing that I love so much. I've done shows about movies. I've done shows about video games. I've talked about books. I've written about movies. I've ranked TV shows. But I've never just purely talked about horror. I've just never taken a dive into that side. I mean, horror may be my absolute favorite thing in the world. Books, movies, music, video games, comics, actors, directors, writers. I have been obsessed as long as I can remember. So the question you have to ask is, when you talk about something you love so dear, where do you begin? So I think really the only answer to that is to start at where the obsession began. So today I want to talk about the thing that really led me to my obsession. The thing that really got me to the point where I just wanted to consume as much horror media as I possibly could. So in 1997, a TV miniseries based off a work by Stephen King had come out. It had already had one critically acclaimed film, so you have to ask, who was bold enough to want to remake something like that? Well, Stephen King did. He wanted to. So welcome to Season 1, Episode 1 of the Neon Horror Show. A show that I hope sets to capture what makes horror work and why does it resonate with so many and find so little respect. So for an inaugural episode, I want to discuss 1997's The Shining. So let's go back to 1997. Where did I first see this? Because I think that's important. I think when you're talking about these sort of things, it's very critical for you to originate where you saw it at and where you saw it. What gave you the need? What sparked the fire, if you will? So 1997, it was the summertime. And so part of me has always associated summertime with horror. And maybe it was that time. If you go back in that time in the 90s, there was a lot of these road trip-ish horror movies that took place in the summertime, in the desert, whether it be, what was it called? Freeway? No, not Freeway. U-Turn. U-Turn. That was kind of a thriller more than a horror. Or Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 3, or From Dusk Till Dawn. I have a tendency to, or even Tremors. The desert heat in the summer I associate with that time of horror, and I always will. So I remember I was traveling with my grandfather, who at the time was he was a district manager for an insurance company. So he would travel to different areas and talk to agents, and he would take me with me in the summer because I would spend my summers with him. Well, one of the things he knew that I really loved was to read. So I used to bring books, and I used to go down to this place in Lubbock, Texas called Pink's Bookstore. And he would trade in a bunch of books, and I would buy a bunch of books on his credit. And it really got me into reading. Well, that summer I'd kicked off in 1997. I'd been reading a lot of horror novels. I'd started with Dean Koontz, more so because I always heard he was pretty good. But I didn't find it to my liking. It felt more like thriller, less horror. It wasn't really what I was looking for. But if any of you can recommend a good Dean Koontz book, please let me know. And then I jumped over to Stephen King. I had known about Stephen King forever. At this time, I was 97, I was 11 years old. I knew who Stephen King was. I'd never read any Stephen King, but I knew his name, and I knew he was like the all-time great, the master of horror novels. And so the book that I picked up was actually Pet Sematary. And we're on this road trip from Lubbock to, I believe it's Abilene, that we're going to go visit this agent of his. So the entire time I'm tearing through Pet Sematary. I can't put it down. And it scares the shit out of me. It absolutely terrifies me. So I'm going through Pet Sematary. It takes me a couple of days to really just read the entire book. And I get done, and we get to the hotel, and he's got to go out and meet this agent of his, and I don't want to go. I want to hang out by myself. I'm 11. I want to read this book and finish it. So I finish it in the hotel room, and then I turn on the television. And what is playing? It's on the Sci-Fi Channel. It's Stephen King's The Shining. And so I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies at the time, so I knew there was no way that I was going to be able to see Jack Nicholson's The Shining. The only thing I knew about Jack Nicholson's The Shining at the time was the axe scene, the Wendy, where he's busting through the door, and you know he gives his extremely famous line, "Here's Johnny," and that's the only thing I'd seen. I'd seen it on late night, and people had parodied it on Mad TV and Saturday Night Live. But this was the way. This was the way I was going to get to watch The Shining. I was like, okay, so it's on TV. It's a Sci-Fi Channel. I know it's safe for me to watch. I know I'm not going to get in trouble. I'm 11 years old. I can watch this. Boy, was I not prepared whatsoever. Not even close to prepared for what this movie was going to do to me. So I knew it had originally aired on ABC, but this was later on. And I'm watching it, and I'm just like, okay, so this is the guy, Steven Weber. He was from Wings. It was a TV show that was pretty popular at the time. So I knew him, and I was like, he's funny. He's funny on Wings. And I was like, okay, Rebecca De Mornay, I kind of knew who she was watching the movie. I had seen her in a couple of things. I wasn't super familiar with her, but I watched a lot of sitcoms growing up, so I really knew who Steven Weber was. And the kid, Danny Torrance, was played by Cortland Meade, who's, you know, he was a child actor at the time. He'd been around. He was in Little Rascals. I had seen him on Conan O'Brien a couple of times. I know he was in Tom and Huck, and I used to love Tom and Huck. So I used to watch Tom and Huck constantly all the time. The actual VHS version. And then it had Melvin Van Peebles as Dick Halloran. I didn't know who Melvin Van Peebles was at the time, but oh boy, if you do not know his movies, especially his old school stuff, the stuff that he wrote and directed, created, and starred in, especially something like Sweetback's Badass Song, you need to go check that out. And if you don't know, Melvin is the father to Mario Van Peebles. And Mario's been in a ton of stuff, from New Jack City to the Cotton Club. I mean, just amazing kind of. He's been in a whole lot. He's been around a long time. He's been on the X-Files, NCIS, all sorts of stuff. So I highly recommend checking that out. But anyway, getting back to The Shining. So I knew very little about The Shining, but what happened is I sat there and was captivated for 2 days. Terrified. Absolutely terrified. I didn't want to see what would happen when, Danny, opened that door or walked down that hall, and I didn't want to see what Jack was going to do to his family and how this would all end and how everything would finish. And the ghosts in this haunted hotel. And I didn't understand at the time, that most of this was about, a writer dealing with multiple things. The pressure from the outside, alcoholism, writers dealing with, the solitude of that sort of job of creation and the madness that can come with it. I didn't understand that. All I knew is that Steven Weber, this guy from Wings, was absolutely terrorizing his son and his wife, Danny and Wendy, and there were ghosts. There were a ton of ghosts. Actually, if you look on the sidebar, that way, yeah, that's one of them. That's one of my absolute favorites. The makeup's absolutely incredible. So the reason, though, that this movie got made, The Shining, was because it's pretty notorious now if you're in the horror community. Stephen King did not like at all the Stanley Kubrick version of The Shining, which most people consider a classic horror movie these days. And for good reason. I love them both for very different reasons. But yes, the 1980 Shining is very dreamlike. It's got a lot of strange logic to it with the hotel design and, you know, kind of the back and forth between Danny and Wendy is extremely intense and very hard to watch at times. And it's got this kind of strange dream logic and interstitials that really make it an experience. And the Shining miniseries for me is a story. It is the story from beginning to end that Stephen King wanted to tell. It's got the plot beats. It doesn't have the dream logic necessarily that's being used or a lot of the imagery. But what makes 1997's The Shining stand out to me, and actually my preferred version of The Shining over the 1980 version, is it's a ghost story. It is a pure, unapologetic ghost story, and that's what it does well. And it's extremely well done. It's got good story beats. It's got excellent scares. It's got good overall atmosphere to it, especially being in the hotel. And the beautiful thing about that is Mick Garris, the man who is a horror legend, if you've never heard of him, who directed 1997's The Shining. Actually, they shot it in the hotel that inspired The Shining. This is the hotel that Stephen King actually wrote about when he was writing The Shining. So, there was something about the 1997 version of The Shining that just resonated. It was terrifying in all the right ways. And, you know, part of it I have to give to the credit of the direction and the acting, of course. I mean, Mick Garris, if you're not familiar with his work, I'd highly recommend checking some of it out. You know, he directed Critters 2, so he gave us the giant Critters ball. He wrote The Fly 2, which, by the way, is a very underrated sequel. He was the story behind Batteries Not Included, which was just this... I love Batteries Not Included as, you know, kind of an 80s movie where extraterrestrial robots visit a building that's going to be abandoned and help them save it. He was the director of Sleepwalkers. He wrote Hocus Pocus. He wrote and directed Riding the Bullet, which is absolutely amazing. It's by far one of my favorite underrated Stephen King TV or movies. It's really good. Check it out. Talk about dream logic in that one for sure. And then recently in 2018, he did the segments for Nightmare Cinema, The Projectionist, and Dead, which were all amazing. Now, as far as that's his movies, television roles, television directing, just incredible. So he started, Mick Garris really started doing this by doing behind the scenes making for stuff that was being made on the time. It's like The Fog, The Howling, The Thing, Videodrome, The Goonies. He did all these directions for, you know, the making of these projects. And then he started into TV and he did, you know, episodes of Amazing Stories and Freddy's Nightmares, which is an incredibly underrated show. I was actually just watching one episode at lunch. Psycho 4, The Beginning, which is so good. The TV miniseries, The Stand, Quicksilver Highway, The Others TV show, and he is probably most well known for creating Masters of Horror, at least in the horror community. Masters of Horror was this amazing project that came from these dinners that Mick Garris hosts, and it was an anthology show on Showtime, and it brought together a bunch of directors to do these 45-minute to an hour-long shows, and it included, Don Coscarelli and Stuart Gordon and Toby Hooper and Dario Argento, Joe Dante, John Landis, John Carpenter, Lucky McKee, who was really popping at the time. I'd like to see him come back. He had May that had come out, and that was an incredibly heartbreaking and twisted film that I absolutely love. And then Mick Garris actually got Takashi Miike all the way from Japan, who, if you don't know Takashi Miike, Audition. It's one of the greatest horror movies ever made. Visitor Q, The Happiness of the Katakaris. Let me look that up. I don't want to get that wrong. It's kind of this amazing, really beautiful, insane, over the top musical zombie movie. Yeah, The Happiness of the Katakaris. I knew it. I absolutely knew it. It's from 2001. Definitely recommend picking that up if you ever get a chance and watching it. But The Shining 1997, with Mick Garris in control and Stephen King having a lot of influence on it. It's got very, careful pacing, and the makeup's incredible, and the depth of the characters and the sound editing and the atmosphere. The atmosphere is what sells it. It's truly what I find to be the definition of atmospheric horror making. I know retrospectively a lot of critics have kind of started to remember this miniseries less fondly. And that's what happens a lot of the times, especially with movies or TV shows, is there's two tales to be told. Either the series comes out, or the show or the movie comes out, and it's critically acclaimed at the time, and then 20 years passes, and it loses some of its appeal, and not everybody's going to like it. And then the opposite, where it comes out and people trash it at the time, and then 20 years later it's a classic. I guess it really just depends on the time, the era, what's going on at the time, and what's going on 20 years later. For me, The Shining holds its appeal. It holds its reality as being an outstanding miniseries, and it's among my favorite version of The Shining, but it's also among what I would count TV horror to be some of the best example of what TV horror could be. Especially made for TV horror, which is a very difficult aspect to pull off in a pre-Netflix world, in a pre-cable world, where you had to be very careful about what lines you crossed. So the horror all really does generate from the pacing and the atmosphere and the performance. It doesn't overly rely on gore or jump scares or, twisted kind of viewpoints in the world, and it feels very much like the haunted house movie of today, or at least of 1997. And it feels like it takes a lot of, and I'd love to talk to Mick Garris one of these days about this, but for me, this version of The Shining feels like it takes a lot from like Shirley Jackson's The Haunting, or The Uninvited from the 40s, or even The Old Dark House from the 30s, which are all amazing films. When the scares generally had to come from atmosphere and creating atmosphere and pulling you in. Because maybe that's the point of this version of The Shining. Maybe it's the best example I can think of, and what I think to be the best example of atmospheric horror. And atmospheric horror done on restriction. It doesn't have, the Netflix, The Haunting of Hill House, where it's got the budget and the effects and the time. It is from 1997, and it was a mini series for ABC, so you have to remember that before watching it. But ultimately, what I would say is this movie is still worth the time. It's still worth the energy to go in and really sit down and allow yourself to be completely overtaken. And put your phone down, put Twitter down, put TikTok down, and just dive in to what Mick Garris and Stephen King have created with The Shining, which is a solid ghost story, a solid haunted house film, and something that is an incredible ride. So that's been this week's ramblings and musings from the Neon Horror Show. I'm going to try to do these just once a week to try to, get stuff moving and just talk about the movies I love as kind of a document, if you will. I've written a ton of written word. I don't want to go back to doing that. And I've done a lot of podcasts, and I don't really want to do that either. So I think I'm just going to do this. I'm going to put out just weekly videos just discussing the things I like. I don't know what next week is going to be. I've watched a lot of good movies this week. I'm going to go back and talk about Dr. X or Svengali or even maybe Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Leatherface Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, because I just saw that for the first time and really enjoyed it. But let me know. Let me know what you think about 1997's The Shining. I have a Gmail somewhere that's created just specifically for this account, but I don't remember what it is. But if you liked it, let me know. And if you didn't, let me know too. All right. Y'all have a good one, and I will see you guys next time on the horrific side of life.